Thessaly heard the words through a door that nobody had bothered to close. She was a mistake. 3 words, the Alpha King's voice, low and irritated. The way someone might speak about a clerical error or a misplaced invoice. Not cruel. Worse than cruel. Dismissive. Like she was a line item that needed correcting. She was standing in the Luna Wing. The Luna Wing, where every chosen mate of every Alpha King had lived for the last 400 years. The walls were hung with silver silk. The bed was enormous and canopied and smelled faintly of cedar and old roses. Moonlight poured through arched windows that overlooked the eastern gardens, and on the vanity, still warm from the oracle's hands, sat the silver circlet that had been placed on Thessaly's head less than 1 hour ago. She could still feel the phantom weight of it on her brow. 1 hour. That was all the time between the most extraordinary moment of her life and the most humiliating. The choosing ceremony had been simple, or it was supposed to be. Oracle Sibylla had walked the line of candidates, 12 noble women in white, daughters of the great houses, each one polished and perfumed and bred for exactly this purpose. Thessaly had not been among them. Thessaly had been in the back of the great hall, tucked behind a column with an ink-stained sleeve and a stack of census ledgers she was meant to be delivering to Councillor Margrave. She was a bookbinder, an archivist in the Royal Library. She repaired cracked spines and restitched loose signatures and catalogued tax records that no one would ever read, and she had no business being anywhere near a choosing ceremony. But Councillor Margrave had a talent for sending her on errands at the worst possible moment, and the census ledgers he needed were apparently so urgent that they couldn't wait until after the sacred rite that would determine the future queen of the realm. So Thessaly had slipped in through the servants' entrance, clutching her stack of ledgers, keeping close to the wall, trying to be exactly what she had always been, invisible. The oracle's flame was supposed to choose. A pale blue fire that burned in the ceremonial basin contained an obedient for centuries. It would lean toward the chosen candidate like a compass finding north, and that woman would become Luna. The flame had not leaned toward any of the 12 noblewomen. It had erupted. Thessaly had felt the heat from 30 feet away. The fire had surged out of the basin, climbed the air in a spiraling column of white and blue, and bent across the entire length of the great hall to point directly at her. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Every face in the room turned. The noblewomen stared, the councillors stared, the guards stared. And at the head of the hall, Alpha King Caedmon Valdrin, who had been watching the proceedings with the detached patience of a man enduring a necessary inconvenience, went completely still. Thessaly had stood there with census ledgers pressed against her chest and ink on her fingers, and thought very clearly, this cannot possibly be happening to me. But it was happening. The 12 noblewomen were staring at her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to barely concealed fury. Lady Ravon, the frontrunner, whose father controlled half the northern territories, had gone so pale her lips were white. The councillors were murmuring. The guards had shifted their weight, uncertain, looking to the king for direction. And the king, Caedmon Valdrin. He had risen from his seat, slowly, and his dark gray eyes had locked onto her across the length of the hall, with an intensity that made her knees buckle. She couldn't read his expression. She couldn't read anything except the wild, desperate hammering of her own pulse. But then Oracle Sibylla had crossed the hall, taken the ledgers gently from her hands, and placed the silver circlet on her head. "The flame has chosen," the oracle said, and her voice carried to every corner of the room. "It is done. It was not done. It was done for exactly 53 minutes. That was how long it took for Thessaly to be escorted to the Luna Wing, dressed in ceremonial silver by servants who wouldn't meet her eyes, and left alone in a room built for queens. 53 minutes before the king's voice drifted through the unclosed door of the adjacent study. "She was a mistake. The oracle is wrong. I will have this corrected by morning." And then Hadric, the king's beta, quieter but audible. "The flame has never been wrong, Caedmon. Not once in 4 centuries. Then it is wrong now. A chair scraped against stone, a bookbinder, an unsigned foundling with no house, no bloodline, no name worth recording. You expect me to present her to the court as Luna? Thessaly's hands had gone numb. She looked down at them, at the ink stains that never quite washed out, at the calluses on her fingertips from years of pressing leather and stitching thread through parchment. No name worth recording. She had always known that about herself. She had known it every morning. She woke in the narrow cot in the servants' quarters. She had known it every time a courtier looked through her like glass. She had known it every time she signed a library requisition form with just Thessaly, because she had no second name to offer. Hearing someone else say it out loud was a different kind of pain. The kind that confirms your worst suspicion about yourself. The one you kept locked in the dark and hoped was just a fear. But it wasn't a fear, it was a fact, and the king himself had said so. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying required an audience who cared, and she had never had one. Instead, she moved, quietly, methodically. The way she did everything. She removed the ceremonial gown and folded it on the bed. She put on her own clothes, the plain brown dress and worn boots she had arrived in. She lifted the silver circlet from her head and set it on the pillow, positioning it carefully in the center, because even now, even in this, she could not bring herself to be careless with something that belonged to the crown. Then she walked out. The corridor was empty. The palace was celebrating somewhere. She could hear distant music and laughter, and the guards stationed at the Luna Wing's entrance had abandoned their posts to join the festivities. No one saw her leave. No one would have tried to stop her if they had. She passed through the eastern gate as the moon climbed above the tree line. The road stretched ahead of her, pale and empty, curving toward the dark edge of the Ashwood forest. Thessaly did not look back. Behind her, in the Luna Wing, the silver circlet caught the last of the candlelight. And in the study next door, the Alpha King continued planning how to undo the Oracle's choice, entirely unaware that his body had already begun to betray him. His hand trembled against the desk. A sharp pain lanced behind his eyes. And deep inside his chest, something that had been barely contained for months, let out a low, furious snarl that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the woman who was walking away from him in the dark. Chadman woke to his own growling. It came from somewhere deep in his ribcage, a vibration that rattled his teeth and made the glass of water on his bedside table shiver. His hands were twisted in the sheets, and when he opened his eyes, his vision was wrong, too sharp, too saturated. The room looked like it had been dipped in amber, every shadow carved with predatory clarity, every dust mote suspended in the lamplight like prey. Wolf eyes. He was seeing through his wolf's eyes. He forced the shift back with a violence that left him gasping. The amber bled out of his vision. The growling stopped. His hands unclenched, and he saw the blood where his own claws had punctured his palms before retracting. The clock on the mantel read just past dawn. The episodes were getting worse. 3 months ago, they happened once a week, then twice, then every other night. Now they were waking him from sleep, dragging him toward a shift he hadn't called for, and each time the wolf was harder to push back down. A knock at his door. Hadrick entered without waiting for permission, which meant something was wrong. "The Luna Wing is empty," the beta said. Kaidman stared at him, still breathing hard, still tasting copper from where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek during the involuntary shift. "What?" "The girl, Thessaly. She's gone." The name struck him square in the chest. His wolf surged forward so hard and so fast that Caedmon's vision flipped to gold again, and he had to grip the edge of the bed frame to keep himself upright. When, he managed through his teeth. Sometime in the night. The guards weren't at their posts. Hadrick's voice was level, but his eyes were watching Caedmon's hands, watching the way his knuckles had gone white around the wood. She left the circlet on the pillow, folded the ceremonial gown, took nothing that wasn't hers. Of course she didn't, Caedmon thought, and the thought arrived with a strange, bitter pang. He didn't want to examine. She wouldn't. He stood, and the room tilted. Not from dizziness, something worse. A pulling sensation, deep and visceral, tugging him toward the eastern wall, toward the gate, toward wherever she had gone. This doesn't matter, Kayadman said, forcing his voice flat. I was going to send her away regardless. She's simply saved me the trouble. Hadrick didn't respond immediately. He crossed to the window and looked out toward the tree line, his expression unreadable. Your hands are bleeding, the beta observed. Kayadman looked down. The puncture wounds from his own claws were still open, seeping red onto the white sheets. Normally, a wound that Minor would have closed within seconds, alpha healing. But the blood kept coming slow and steady, and the edges of the punctures looked raw. Your healing is slowing down, Hadrick said, turning from the window. His voice had changed. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something harder. That's the third sign. Caedmon. After the involuntary shifts and the sensory distortion, I know what it is. Then you know what comes next. Silence. Heavy and loaded and full of everything, Kayadman refused to say. What came next was loss of cognitive function. Blackouts that lasted hours instead of seconds. The wolf, taking the body and the man unable to reclaim it. And at the end, when the human mind had been fully consumed, what remained was not a wolf and not a man, but something in between. Something mindless and violent and impossibly strong, feral. Every alpha bloodline carried the risk. The wolf and the human existed in balance, two minds sharing one body, and when that balance broke, the wolf consumed everything. It was rare. It was irreversible, and there was only one protocol for dealing with a feral alpha. His father had gone feral when Caedmon was 17. The decline had been slow at first, almost imperceptible. A flash of amber eyes at dinner, a growl during a council session, that his father waved off as frustration. Then the blackouts began. Minutes at first, then hours. His mother had hidden it from the court for as long as she could, covering for the absences, making excuses, holding the kingdom together with both hands, while the man she loved disappeared, piece by piece, into something that wore his face but was no longer him. By the end, he didn't recognize her. He didn't recognize anyone. The thing that had been King Aldrin Valdrin had to be put down in the courtyard, and Caedmon, standing in the rain at 17 years old, had been the one to give the order. He could still hear the sound the blade had made, could still see his mother's face. Could still feel the exact moment the crown passed to him, not with ceremony or celebration, but with blood on the cobblestones, and his mother's scream echoing off the palace walls. Now, the same thing was happening to him. And until last night, he had believed there was nothing anyone could do about it. The oracle's flame pointed to that girl for a reason, Hadrick said quietly. The flame chooses the one who anchors the alpha. That's not tradition. Caedmon? That's function. The Lunabond stabilizes the wolf. I don't need a lecture on pack mythology. It's not mythology. It's biology. Hadrick took a step closer, lowering his voice even though they were alone. Last night, during the ceremony, when she was standing in front of you with the circlet on her head, your vitals dropped to normal for the first time in 3 months. Your pupils were stable. Your scent was clean. No trace of the feral markers I was watching. Caedmon, you were calm. Caedmon remembered. He remembered the strange, sudden stillness that had washed through him when the flame bent toward the girl in the back of the hall. The way his wolf, restless and snarling for months, had simply gone quiet, like an animal that had been pacing its cage for so long it had forgotten what peace felt like. And then suddenly, inexplicably, remembered. He remembered the way she'd looked at him when the oracle placed the circlet on her head. Not with ambition or triumph, or the calculating hunger he saw in every noblewoman who had ever angled for his attention. She had looked at him with terror, and beneath the terror, something so open and unguarded and honest, that it had cracked something in his chest he hadn't known was sealed. He had not let himself think about what that meant. He had crushed it, buried it, told himself and his court that the flame was wrong, and now she was gone, and his wolf was screaming, and the pulling sensation behind his sternum was getting stronger with every passing second. "She's a bookbinder," Kaidmon said, and even he could hear how hollow the objection sounded. "She's your mate," Hadrick replied, "and you told your entire court she was a mistake. And now she's gone, and your wolf is trying to claw its way out of your body to find her." He paused. "So what would you like to do about that?" Another surge. Kaidmon's spine bowed, his shoulders rolling forward as something inside him fought to reshape his bones. He caught it barely, slamming his fist against the bedpost hard enough to crack the wood. "Find her," he said through gritted teeth. Now Hadrick was already moving toward the door. "Trackers are assembling, but Kaidmon." He stopped in the doorway and looked back. "She left through the eastern gate. The trail leads into the Ashwood." The words landed like ice water. The Ashwood, the burned-out skeleton of a forest, where the rebellion had happened, where Haidman had fought, and bled, and done the one thing he could never undo, where his brother Torvin had died by his hand. "No one goes into the Ashwood," Kaidman whispered. "She did," Hadrick said. "So now you will, too." Thessaly had not planned to enter the Ashwood. She had planned to walk to the village of Brindleford, 12 miles east, where she could find work at a print shop or a bookbinder's stall, or anywhere that didn't require a bloodline or a surname or a divine fire selecting her for a role she was spectacularly unqualified to fill. She had planned to disappear into the kind of quiet, unremarkable life she had always lived, and she had planned to do it before anyone noticed she was gone. The Ashwood had other ideas. The forest began gradually, the way forests do. The road narrowed, the trees thickened. The moonlight thinned to pale threads between the branches, and by the time Thessaly realized she had veered off the main road and onto a game trail, she was already deep enough that turning back felt less certain than pressing forward. The air was wrong in here, heavy and metallic like the taste of a coming storm, but there was no wind. The trees grew at angles that didn't follow any logic she understood, their trunks leaning away from some invisible center as though something at the heart of the forest was repelling them. The silence was not the peaceful silence of a sleeping wood. It was the held-breath silence of a place that was listening. Thessaly walked faster. She found the village just before dawn, or what was left of it. A cluster of stone foundations and collapsed roofs, scorched black and overgrown with pale moss that seemed to glow faintly in the pre-dawn light. The Ashwood Rebellion had torn through here 3 years ago. She had read about it in the archive. Dry accounts of territory disputes, of Kaidmon's half-brother Torvin rallying border packs against the crown, of the fighting that followed. The reports had not mentioned how the burned stones still smelled of ash after 3 years. They had not mentioned the claw marks gouged into the remaining walls, deep enough to have been made by something enormous and desperate and out of its mind. She chose the least damaged structure, a cottage with 2 standing walls and most of a roof, and tucked herself into the corner. Her feet ached, her stomach was hollow. She pulled her knees to her chest and dropped her forehead against them, and tried very hard not to think. She failed completely. No name worth recording. The words circled like vultures. She had spent 22 years in the palace, raised in the servants' quarters after being left on the kitchen steps as an infant. No note, no token, no explanation, just a baby wrapped in undyed cloth, anonymous from the very first breath. Vedra, the head librarian, had taken her in when she was old enough to be useful, had taught her to read, to mend torn pages, to love the smell of old paper and binding glue. Vedra had given her a purpose, and Thessaly had clung to it the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. Be useful. Be invisible. Don't take up more space than you've earned. And she had been so careful, so meticulously, painfully careful, to never want more than what was offered, to never reach for something above her station, to never ever let herself believe she might be worth choosing. And then the flame had chosen her anyway, and for 53 stupid, glorious minutes, she had allowed herself to feel it. The warmth of the circlet on her head. The impossible, terrifying, magnificent thought that maybe, just maybe, she was supposed to be something more. She was a mistake. Thessaly buried her face against her knees and breathed through the ache. She must have slept, because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the gaps in the ruined roof, and someone was standing in the doorway. Kedman looked worse than she did. His shirt was torn at the collar. His dark hair was disheveled, damp with sweat. His eyes were wrong, flickering between their natural dark gray and a burning gold that made her stomach drop. His hands hung at his sides, and she could see the tendons in his forearms standing out like cables, his fingers curling and uncurling in a rhythm that didn't look voluntary. He was breathing hard, not from running, from restraint. "You need to come back," he said, and his voice came out fractured, like he was speaking through clenched teeth and a locked jaw simultaneously. Thessaly stood slowly. Her back was stiff, her legs aching from the walk, and dried tear tracks she hadn't known were there tightened on her cheeks. "You said I was a mistake," she replied. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Good," he flinched. Actually flinched, like she'd struck him. Something shifted behind his eyes, the gold flaring brighter, and his hand shot out to grip the doorframe. The wood groaned under the pressure. "I was wrong," he ground out. "Were you?" "Yes. Because you've had a sudden change of heart overnight, or because you need something from me." The question landed like a blade, and she watched it cut. His jaw worked. The wolf behind his eyes pulsed. He didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. "That's what I thought," Thessaly said quietly. Something cracked in the doorframe. She looked and saw that his fingers had splintered the wood, the grain splitting beneath a grip that was no longer entirely human. His nails were too long, too curved, not claws, not yet, but close. Then she saw the blood. His palms were slick with it, crescent wounds that weren't healing, and the veins in his wrists had darkened to a bruised violet that looked deeply, fundamentally wrong. "What's happening to you?" she whispered. He released the doorframe and stepped back, hiding his hands. "Nothing. You need to come back. It isn't safe here." "For whom?" Thessaly asked. Before he could answer, the sound of horses broke through the trees. Hadric emerged from the forest with 4 mounted guards, and the relief on the beta's face, when he saw them both standing, was so profound, it answered more questions than anything the king had said. They brought her back. Not to the Lunawing. To a small chamber on the 3rd floor, connected to the king's quarters by a single door. Hadric explained it privately, standing in the corridor outside, while 2 servants prepared the room. "The king has a condition," Hadric said. "It's been worsening for months. We've tried healers, herbalists, pharmaceutical remedies, spiritual interventions. Nothing works. And I do," Thessaly said flatly. "Your proximity stabilizes him. We don't fully understand why." The oracle's flame understood why. Hadric was quiet for a moment. "Yes, it did." Thessaly leaned against the corridor wall and stared at the ceiling. She was exhausted and hungry, and her chest ached with a bruise that had no physical source. She didn't owe this man anything. He had called her a mistake in front of his entire court. He had planned to discard her before dawn. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked. "He dies," Hadric said simply. "Slowly at first, then all at once, and when it happens, it won't be peaceful. The kingdom will lose its king, and the manner of his death will destabilize every pack in the territory." Thessaly closed her eyes. She thought of the blood on his hands, the wounds that wouldn't close, the look on his face in that ruined doorway. Not arrogance, not command. Terror, the kind of terror that comes from feeling your own body turn against you. She thought of the flame bending toward her across the great hall, the warmth on her forehead, 53 minutes of believing she mattered. "I'll stay," she said. "But not for him, not yet." Hadric nodded. He didn't ask who she was staying for. Perhaps he already knew. From behind the connecting door came a sound that stopped her breath. A low, guttural snarl that vibrated through the wood and into the stone beneath her feet. Then the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. Then silence. "What exactly is happening to him?" Thessaly whispered. Hadric looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away without answering. The arrangement, as Hadric called it, was straightforward. Thessaly stayed in the adjoining chamber. The connecting door remained open. She was not required to interact with the king, to speak to him, to acknowledge him, or to do anything at all except exist within proximity. Nobody explained why proximity mattered. Nobody explained the condition. Nobody explained anything. Thessaly found this infuriating. On the first morning, she sat in her room, with her arms crossed, and listened to the king working at his desk on the other side of the open doorway. The scratch of his pen on parchment, the occasional murmur as he dictated notes to himself, the creak of his chair when he shifted his weight. She did not look at him. She stared at the wall and felt furious and invisible and deeply, confusingly aware of his presence in a way she couldn't explain. It was like standing near a hearth. She could feel his warmth, even with her back turned. Something in her chest hummed faintly, a low vibration she had never felt before, and it grew quieter whenever he moved, farther away, and stronger whenever he came close. On the second morning, someone had left a stack of books on the table beside her chair. 3 volumes of Aldessi's siege campaigns of the Northern Territories, a text so rare that the Royal Library only had 1 copy, which Thessaly had personally rebound twice because the binding kept cracking from age. She looked at the books, she looked at the open doorway. The king was writing, his head bent, his posture rigid with the careful control she was beginning to recognize as his permanent state. "These are from the restricted archive," Thessaly said. "Are they?" Caedmon replied without looking up. "They require written authorization from the head librarian to be removed from the reading room. Do they? Did Vaedra authorize this?" "I am the king," Caedmon said, still not looking up. "I do not require authorization." Thessaly opened the first volume and did not say, "Thank you." She read instead, and the silence between them settled into something that was not comfortable, but was at least not hostile. A ceasefire, fragile and undeclared. On the third day, the tea appeared. Not the standard palace blend that tasted like boiled twigs, but Vaedra's personal mixture, blackberry leaf and dried honeysuckle, and the faintest trace of mint, the blend that Thessaly drank every afternoon in the library while she worked. The blend that no one outside the archive even knew existed. It was waiting on her side table when she arrived in the evening, steaming gently in a ceramic cup that was nicer than anything she had ever drunk from. "Where did this come from?" she asked. Caedmon turned a page of his report. "I have no idea what you're referring to. This is Vaedra's private blend." Someone would have had to go to the library, ask Vaedra specifically for it, and bring it here. "That does sound like quite an ordeal. Did you do this?" "I am extremely busy, as you can see." He gestured at the report in front of him without lifting his gaze from it. Thessaly picked up the cup, took a sip, and felt the warmth spread through her chest. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. She failed. A rhythm developed, reluctantly. In the mornings, Thessaly returned to the library to work. Vaedra, who had the rare gift of knowing everything and saying very little, asked no questions about the new living arrangement. She simply adjusted the work schedule and gave Thessaly a knowing look that Thessaly chose not to interrogate. In the evenings, Thessaly came to her chamber, and the king worked in his, and the open doorway sat between them like a border neither of them crossed. The books kept appearing. Military history, cartography, a beautifully illustrated bestiary. She had coveted for years. Each one was placed on her table without comment. Each one was denied. "The bestiary," she said on the 5th evening. "What bestiary?" "The one with the hand-painted illustrations of northern wolves that I have been trying to get approved for restoration for 2 years. I am unfamiliar with such a volume. It is sitting on my table. How mysterious." Thessaly shook her head, but the corner of her mouth twitched, and she saw his pen pause for just a fraction of a second before he resumed writing. On the 7th evening, she was reading aloud to herself. It was a habit she'd developed as a child in the archive. Alone with the books and no one to talk to, and she did it without thinking. A passage from Aldessi about the siege of Thornwall, the tactical decision to flood the eastern valley, rather than lose the garrison. That account is wrong, Caedmon said. Thessaly looked up startled. He was watching her from his desk, his pen lowered, and it was the first time he had voluntarily initiated conversation. What do you mean? She asked. Aldesi claims the garrison commander ordered the flood. He didn't. It was the supply officer, a woman named Drenna Calloway, who realized the dam could be breached manually if someone climbed the eastern face during the storm. Aldesi credited her superior, because he couldn't conceive of a woman making that kind of tactical decision. Thessaly stared at him. How do you know that? Because the Calloway family served my house for 6 generations. Her journals are in the private collection. I read them when I was 12. Can I see them? The question came out before she could stop it, breathless and eager and utterly stripped of the icy distance she had been maintaining. Something shifted in his face, the hard line of his jaw softened. His eyes, which had been dark and guarded since the moment she arrived, warmed by exactly 1 degree. I'll have them sent, he said. That night, Thessaly found herself talking. Not reading aloud, talking. About the archive, about Vedra's impossible filing system, about the apprentice who had once shelved 300 land deeds in reverse chronological order and caused a minor bureaucratic crisis that took 2 weeks to untangle. Caedmon listened. She could tell he was listening because his pen stopped moving, and because when she paused to take a breath, the silence had a different quality, attentive, present. She talked until her voice grew soft, and when she glanced through the doorway, his head was resting on his folded arms. His breathing had deepened. The rigid tension that lived permanently in his shoulders had dissolved. He was asleep, at his desk, in the middle of the evening, with his reports still spread out beneath him, and a half-written sentence trailing off the edge of the page. Thessaly watched him for a long time. The firelight caught the angles of his face, and without the tension and the control and the guarded coldness, he looked younger, tired in a way that sleep alone couldn't fix, the kind of tired that lives in the bones. Something turned over in her chest, not forgiveness. Not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that frightened her. The next evening, before she even opened her book, he asked, "What happened with the land deeds?" Thessaly's breath caught. He'd been listening. He remembered. He wanted to hear more. The apprentice blamed the new numbering system, she said, settling into her chair. But really, I think she just couldn't read Vedra's handwriting. Nobody can. I'm fairly certain Vedra's handwriting is a classified form of encryption. His mouth moved. Not a smile. Not quite, but the ghost of one. A crease at the corner of his lips that he smoothed away almost immediately. But she saw it. 2 weeks in. Thessaly was reading in her chair when an advisor named Counselor Pemberton arrived for an evening briefing. Caedmon had explained her presence as a scribe assigned to assist with archival cross-referencing, which was a transparent fiction that Pemberton clearly didn't believe, but was too wise to question. She sat in the corner, with a ledger open on her lap, ostensibly taking notes, and watched the meeting unfold. Pemberton was discussing a border dispute. Caedmon asked precise, measured questions. His voice was controlled. His posture was commanding. He was every inch the king. Then it happened. It started with his hand. A tremor, subtle, barely visible, running through his fingers where they rested on the desk. His pen wobbled. He set it down casually, folding his hands together, but Thessaly saw the way his knuckles whitened with the effort. The tremor spread. His jaw tightened. A muscle in his neck began to twitch. And his eyes, for just a flash, just a heartbeat, went amber gold. Pemberton didn't notice. He was looking at a map, tracing a boundary line, with his finger talking about water rights. Caedmon's gaze found Thessaly's across the room. And in that single, unguarded look, she saw it. Panic. Raw. Desperate panic. From a man who was losing a battle with his own body in front of a witness who could never be allowed to know. His hand spasmed. His fingers curled, the nails lengthening, darkening, sharpening into something that was not quite human. "Counselor," Thessaly said, standing abruptly, "forgive me, but the king has a prior engagement that I failed to remind him of. Could we resume this briefing tomorrow morning? Pemberton looked startled, but nodded. He gathered his maps and left with a bow that Caedmon returned with a rigid nod, his hands hidden beneath the desk. The moment the door closed, Caedmon's control shattered. His chair slammed backward as he stood, his shoulders hunched, his spine curving forward, and what tore out of him was not a word and not a growl, but something between the two. His hands gripped the edge of the desk and she heard the wood crack. His eyes were full amber now, blazing, and the veins in his forearms had gone that dark, bruised violet again. "Get out," he gritted through teeth that were too sharp. Thessaly didn't move. Thessaly. Her name came out distorted, guttural, barely human. "Get out now." "No," she said. She walked toward him. Her heart hammered so hard it echoed in her temples, but her feet kept moving, one step and then another, until she was standing directly beside him. His wolf was right there, behind his eyes. Not the mindless fury she had expected, but something else entirely. Recognition. Desperate, aching recognition. Like an animal that had been lost in the dark and had just caught a familiar scent, she put her hand on his arm. The effect was instantaneous. The gold drained from his eyes like water pulled through sand. His breathing hitched, then steadied. The tremors stopped. The sharpness of his teeth softened. His claws retracted, leaving only the crescent wounds in his palms and the cracked desk, and the silence of a room that had almost become something much worse. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face, and for one unguarded, uncontrolled moment, every wall he had built came down. She saw fear and gratitude and shame, and something else, something bright and terrified, that he buried so fast she almost missed it. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "I don't know," she said. And she meant it. He didn't pull away from her touch. She didn't remove her hand. They stood like that for a long moment, connected by 5 points of contact, her fingers against his sleeve, while the fire crackled and the cracked desk settled, and the world outside continued, without knowing how close it had come to losing its king. That night, long after Caedmon had fallen asleep at his desk, listening to her voice, Thessaly lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the humming in her chest. It was stronger now. It had been growing every day, a low, warm vibration that pulsed in time with something she couldn't identify, and it responded to him. When he was near, it settled. When he was far, it ached. When she had touched his arm tonight, it had flared so bright. She almost gasped. She was still trying not to think about it when the sound came. Not from his chambers. From deeper. From somewhere inside the walls themselves, echoing through stone and timber and bone, a howl, long, low and saturated with a grief so raw it made her eyes sting. Not a wolf calling to its pack. A wolf calling for something it had lost and could never find. A wolf tearing itself apart from the inside out. And beneath her skin, in the space behind her ribs, where the humming lived, something she had never felt before stirred in response. Something that was not quite hers, something that answered. Thessaly pressed her hand to her chest and felt her heart racing, and felt the other pulse, the new one, the one that was not her own heartbeat, but matched it perfectly, and she thought, what is happening to me? Vedra was waiting for her in the library the next morning with 2 cups of honeysuckle tea and an expression that meant business. "Sit down," the head librarian said. Thessaly sat. "You've been sleeping in a chamber connected to the king's quarters for 2 weeks, Vedra said, pushing one of the cups toward her. "The entire palace is whispering, and I've been patient, but my patience has limits. Talk." Thessaly wrapped her hands around the cup and stared into the honey-colored liquid. She had been keeping the secret because Hadric had asked her to, because the arrangement was supposed to be temporary, because she didn't fully understand it herself, but the humming in her chest had grown louder overnight. It was no longer a faint vibration she could ignore. It was a steady pulse, warm and insistent, and it was synchronized to something she could not see. "He's sick," Thessaly said quietly. Something is wrong with his wolf. Vedra's expression didn't change, but her hands went still around her cup. Go on. His eyes go amber without warning. His claws extend when he doesn't call them. He trembles, and the veins in his arms turn dark, and when it gets bad, he loses himself completely. Last night, during a meeting with Councillor Pemberton, I thought he was going to shift right there at his desk. The library was silent around them. Early morning light fell through the tall windows in pale columns, illuminating the dust motes that drifted between the shelves. And your presence stops it, Vedra said. Not a question. I touched his arm and it stopped instantly, like blowing out a candle. Vedra closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the look on her face was one Thessaly had never seen before. Fear. Actual fear, from a woman who had survived plagues and palace coups, and the destruction of 3 separate archive collections without ever raising her voice above a measured calm. The king is going feral, Vedra said. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Thessaly had read about feral alphas, dry clinical descriptions in medical texts she had catalogued years ago, the progressive dissolution of the human psyche. The wolf consuming the man. Stage 1 was sensory distortion and involuntary partial shifts. Stage 2 was blackouts, periods where the wolf held the body and the human mind was locked away. Stage 3 was permanence. The wolf took the body entirely, the human mind dissolved, and what remained was something powerful and mindless and violent. There was no stage 4. There was only the blade. His father, Thessaly whispered. King Aldrin. Yes. Vedra's voice was steady, but her hands were not. It took Aldrin 11 months from first symptoms to full dissolution. Cadmon was 17 when he had to order the execution of his own father. The boy stood in the rain and watched the only parent he had left die like an animal. His mother never recovered. She followed Aldrin to the grave within the year. She paused, letting that settle. And now the same thing is happening to her son, and he has been hiding it from everyone, because admitting it out loud makes it real. Thessaly's stomach turned over. How long has he had symptoms? Based on what you've described, and what I've suspected for some time, at least 4 months, possibly longer. He hides it well. He has always hidden everything well. The boy learned too young that showing weakness in this palace gets people killed. Vedra's gaze sharpened. The Luna bond is the only known stabilizer for a fragmenting wolf. The flame didn't choose you by accident, child. It chose you, because without you, the king will die the same death as his father. And based on the rate of progression you're describing, he doesn't have long. The weight of that settled on Thessaly's shoulders, like something physical. She thought of the way his hand had spasmed last night, the way his eyes had gone gold with panic, the way he had looked at her when she touched his arm and his control came flooding back, the raw gratitude in his expression. The shame beneath it. Does he know? Thessaly asked. That he's going feral? Of course. That you're his mate? Vedra raised one eyebrow. He knows. He's known since the flame chose you. That's why he fought it. Accepting a mate means admitting what's happening to him. And Cadmon would rather die than admit weakness. Thessaly opened her mouth to respond, but the humming in her chest suddenly spiked. A jolt of something. Electric, sharp and urgent, and impossible to ignore. Something's wrong, she said. Standing so abruptly her chair scraped across the stone floor. She didn't wait for Vedra's response. She ran. The corridors blurred past her, up the stairs, through the eastern gallery, past 2 guards who called after her but didn't follow. The humming was a roar now, a vibration that filled her entire body, and she could feel him through it. Fear, fury, and beneath both, a vast, formless darkness that was swallowing everything. She threw open the connecting door. Cadmon was on the floor, not collapsed. Crouched on his hands and knees, his fingers digging into the stone hard enough to leave gouges. His back arched unnaturally, the muscles beneath his shirt rippling and shifting in ways that shouldn't be possible without a full transformation. His eyes were pure amber, and when he lifted his head to look at her, there was no recognition in them. The wolf stared out at her from the king's face, and it was lost. Completely, utterly lost. Caedmon, Thessaly said, dropping to her knees in front of him. She reached for his face with both hands. The moment her skin touched his, the world fell away. She was somewhere else, somewhere broken. The landscape stretched in both directions, but it was split down the middle as though a giant blade had cleaved the earth in two. The air tasted of iron and ash and something older, something primal, that made her skin prickle and her breath come short. On one side, firelight. Warm amber, the crackling energy of something alive and powerful and ancient. A vast forest of flame-colored trees, stretching to a horizon that pulsed like a heartbeat. On the other, cold, blue-gray stillness, controlled and measured and human. A landscape of stone corridors and ordered shelves, and the quiet precision of a mind that survived by keeping everything in its place. And between them, a crack in the ground that widened as she watched, black and bottomless and hungry, devouring the edges of both sides with a patience that made her stomach drop. The fracture. The wolf stood on the amber side, massive and dark-furred, pacing the edge of the crack with a frantic, maddened energy. It was enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf she had ever seen, and its eyes burned like forge coals. On the blue-gray side, Caedmon stood with his arms at his sides, watching the wolf with an expression of absolute devastation. They were splitting apart, the wolf and the man, separating, and the crack between them was growing. Then, the memory hit her, not hers, his, a burning forest. The Ashwood, 3 years ago, every tree ablaze, the screaming of wolves caught in the fire. A figure ahead of him, on its knees, a man with Caedmon's jawline and darker hair, and eyes that flickered between amber and gray, so fast they looked like sparks. Torvin. The name tore out of Caedmon's throat. The figure looked up, and for one heartbeat the amber cleared. Torvin's own eyes, human and aware, and filled with terrible understanding. He said something, one word, a name. Then the wildness consumed him again, and he lunged with teeth and claws, and Caedmon raised the blade. Thessaly screamed. She was on the floor of the king's chambers, gasping, her hands still cupping Caedmon's face. He was staring at her, fully human, his breathing ragged, his cheeks wet. His hands had come up to grip her wrists, not to pull them away, but to hold them there, as though her touch was the only thing keeping him tethered to the surface. Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The silence was enormous. She could still feel the afterimage of the fracture behind her eyes, the chasm, the splitting landscape, the terrible memory of the burning forest, and the brother who said his name before the wolf reclaimed him. "You saw it," he whispered. "Not a question." "Yes," Thessaly breathed. "I saw Torvin. I saw the Ashwood. I felt what you felt when you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The look on his face told her he already knew exactly how much she had witnessed. His face closed, like a door slamming shut. He pulled away from her hands, stood and crossed the room. He kept his back to her, and she could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Don't speak of this," he said. "To anyone. Ever. Caedmon, what I saw in there, the crack between you and your wolf, it's getting wider. If we don't," I said, "don't speak of it." The words hit the air like a slap. Thessaly flinched, but she didn't drop her gaze. "You can't pretend this isn't happening," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I was inside your mind, Caedmon. I felt what you feel. The guilt is eating you alive, and it's feeding the fracture. And if you don't let someone help you, leave," he said. Now he didn't shout this time. That was almost worse. The word came out quiet, controlled, final, delivered with the practiced authority of a king, giving a command he expected to be obeyed without question. Thessaly left. She made it to the corridor before her legs gave out. She slid down the wall and sat in the dark, with her spine against the cold stone, breathing through the ache in her chest, listening to the silence on the other side of the door. The next morning, Hadrick appeared at the library. "The arrangement is concluded," the beta said, his voice carefully neutral. "The king has requested that you return to your quarters in the servants' wing. Your duties in the archive will resume as normal." Thessaly looked up from the binding press where she was repairing a cracked spine. Her hands were steady, her voice was not. "Did he say why?" "He said the experiment produced no useful results." Hadrick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I disagreed, for what it's worth. But he's the king. He's the king." Thessaly set down the awl she was holding and pressed her palms flat against the workbench. The vibration behind her ribs, which had been a warm, steady pulse for weeks, had changed overnight. It felt wrong now, strained, like a rope pulled too tight, quivering at a frequency that made her teeth ache. "Is he worse?" she asked. Hadrick didn't answer, which was an answer. The first 3 days were manageable. Thessaly returned to her cot in the servants' quarters, returned to her routine in the archive, returned to the invisible life she had lived for 22 years before a divine flame had pointed at her and changed everything. She told herself she was fine. She repeated it until it sounded true. She was fine. She had survived worse. She had survived being abandoned as an infant, survived growing up nameless in a palace full of people who looked through her, survived 22 years of being no one. She could survive this. By the 4th day, she knew she was lying. The headaches began on the morning of the 2nd day. Dull at first, a pressure behind her eyes that she attributed to poor sleep. By the 3rd day, they were sharp enough to make her wince when she turned her head. By the 4th, the light from the library windows felt like needles, and she had to work with the curtains drawn and a cold compress held to her temples. The chest pain followed. Not the sharp, identifiable pain of injury, but something deeper, a hollow aching, like something had been removed from inside her ribcage and the empty space was collapsing inward. It worsened whenever she thought of him, which was constantly, because the pulse beneath her ribs was still there, fainter now, strained and stuttering, but connected to him across the distance, and through it she could feel his deterioration, like an echo of her own. He was getting worse. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. The fracture was widening, the wolf was gaining ground, and he was alone. On the 5th day, Vedra found her crying in the archive stacks. Thessaly hadn't meant to cry. She had been reaching for a volume on the upper shelf when a wave of dizziness hit her so hard she had to grab the shelving to keep from falling. The room spun, and with the spinning came a surge of emotion that wasn't entirely hers. Grief, guilt, rage, and beneath all of it, a howling, desperate loneliness that tore through her defenses and brought the tears before she could stop them. "This is the bond," Vedra said, crouching beside her on the floor. "It's incomplete, and the distance is straining it. You're feeling what he feels, Thessaly, and what he feels right now is tearing him apart. He sent me away," Thessaly managed through the tears. "He doesn't want my help. He doesn't want to kill you," Vedra corrected quietly. "There's a difference." On the 6th day she saw him. She was crossing the courtyard with a stack of requisition forms when she caught a glimpse of him on the upper balcony. He was leaning against the stone railing, and even from 50 feet below she could see the changes. He was thinner. His posture, always so rigidly controlled, had a hunched quality, like something inside him was curling inward. His hands gripped the railing, and she could see the tremors from where she stood. Their eyes met across the distance. The thread between them pulled taut so violently, she gasped. She felt his wolf surge forward through the bond, felt the desperate howling recognition, felt the fracture straining wider. His hands went white on the railing, his jaw clenched. And then he turned away, walked back inside, and disappeared behind the curtain. Thessaly stood in the courtyard with the sun on her face, and the requisition forms crumpled in her shaking hands, and felt the hollow in her chest yawn wider. On the 7th day, she collapsed. She was in the council corridor, delivering a translated border agreement to Councillor Pemberton's office, when the floor tilted beneath her feet. Not dizziness this time. Something deeper. The bond inside her seized, stuttered, and then pulsed, with a violence that whited out her vision. She heard the documents scatter across the stone. She heard someone shout. She heard her own name, distant and muffled, like it was being called from underwater. And then she heard his voice. Thessaly, not from the corridor, from inside her chest, through the bond. A single word saturated with so much anguish that it cut through the white noise and found her. She hit the floor. She didn't feel the impact, but she felt the arms that caught her before her head struck stone. She felt herself being lifted, pulled against a chest that was broader and warmer and more familiar than anything she had ever known. She felt a hand cradling the back of her skull and the frantic hammering of a heartbeat beneath her ear. She smelled him, cedar and iron and something wild, and her wolf. The wolf she hadn't even known she possessed, until 3 weeks ago, pressed toward the surface with a whimper of relief. Consciousness came and went in fragments. The blur of corridor walls moving past, voices sharp and urgent, Hadric's calm commands, Vedra's measured tone cutting through the chaos, and beneath it all, a low, continuous growl from the chest she was held against. Not aggressive, protective, a warning to everyone else in the corridor to stay back. She woke in the infirmary. The light was soft. Evening, she guessed. The familiar smell of dried herbs and linen surrounded her, and for a disoriented moment, she thought she was back in her cot, back in her routine, back in the safe, invisible life she had lived before. Then she turned her head and saw Kaidman. He was sitting in a wooden chair beside her bed, and he looked destroyed, not physically, though that too. The dark circles beneath his eyes were like bruises. The hollows in his cheeks were sharper than she remembered. His hands were bandaged, the knuckles raw, and the veins in his wrists were that terrible bruised violet. But it was his face that broke her. The mask was gone. Every defense, every wall, every carefully constructed barrier of authority and distance and royal indifference had crumbled, and what remained was a man who was terrified of losing something he had only just realized he needed. "You're awake," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. "What happened?" Thessaly murmured. "You fainted," Phaedra said from the doorway. She crossed to the bedside, and the look she gave Cadman was pointed enough to draw blood. Exhaustion, dehydration, and the physiological effects of an incomplete mate bond, being strained beyond its tolerance by forced separation. Kaidman flinched. "In simpler terms," Vedra continued, turning to Thessaly, "you and the king share a forming bond. It has been developing since the oracle's choosing, accelerated by proximity, and the separation nearly broke it. An incomplete bond under that kind of strain can cause organ failure." The silence that followed was suffocating. "You knew," Thessaly whispered, looking at Kaidman. "You knew we were bonded." His jaw worked. His hands clenched in his lap, the bandages tightening over raw knuckles. "I knew," he said, his voice barely audible. "And you sent me away anyway, because if I go feral..." He stopped, swallowed, started again. "When I go feral, anyone bonded to me dies. The mate bond doesn't survive the loss of the alpha's human mind. It collapses, and it takes the mate with it." The words fell like stones into water. Thessaly stared at him, the implications unfolding in her mind one terrible layer at a time. "So, you pushed me away to save my life," she said. "Yes, and instead you nearly killed us both." He had no answer for that. She watched the guilt settle over him like a physical weight, pressing his shoulders down, bowing his head. The same guilt she had felt through the bond. The same guilt she had seen in the fracture, feeding the crack between his wolf and his human self. Vedra looked between them with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Now that we've established that the separation strategy was both medically catastrophic and, strategically, idiotic, perhaps we can discuss alternatives." Saidman's hands were shaking. "There are no alternatives. If the bond completes and I go feral, she dies. And if the bond stays incomplete, she dies anyway," Vedra replied. "So does the bond complete? Or do you both simply die separately and accomplish nothing?" Thessaly reached across the narrow space between the bed and the chair, and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately, reflexively, desperately. And through the bond, she felt his wolf keen with relief. "Let me help you," she said. "Please, stop trying to protect me from yourself." His head dropped forward, his forehead coming to rest against their joined hands. She felt moisture on her knuckles and realized he was crying. "I don't know how to stop," he whispered. "I don't know how to let someone in without destroying them." "Then let me show you," Thessaly said. It was Hadric who told her about Torvin. Not in the infirmary, not with Caedmon present. 2 days after her collapse, when Vaedra had grudgingly released her with strict instructions to remain within proximity of the king at all times, Thessaly found the beta in his office. "I need to know everything," she said without preamble. "About the Ashwood, about his brother, about what I saw inside the fracture." Hadric studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Torvin was 3 years older," Hadric began, his voice measured and careful. "Half-brother, same father, different mother. He was supposed to inherit the crown. Everyone expected it. Torvin was charismatic, beloved by the court, adored by the border packs. Caedmon idolized him." He paused, and something shifted behind his eyes, something old and painful. "Torvin started showing symptoms the year King Aldrin died. The physicians thought it was grief. The sudden shifts, the aggression, the blackouts, all attributed to the trauma of losing his father. By the time anyone realized it was the feral progression, Torvin was already too far gone." Thessaly's throat tightened. "He went feral, not all at once. That's the cruelty of it." Hadric leaned back in his chair. "There were lucid periods. Days, sometimes weeks. He would laugh, tell stories, embrace Caedmon like nothing was wrong. And then the wolf would take his eyes, and he would be gone again, and each time the wolf held him longer." The room felt colder. Thessaly pulled her shawl tighter. "The border packs were already unstable," Hadric continued. "Aldrin's death had left a power vacuum. Torvin, in his feral state, began drawing other fragmented wolves to him. Not consciously. A feral alpha's presence destabilizes vulnerable wolves in the territory. They gathered around him like moths around a flame, and together they became something dangerous. The Ashwood Rebellion wasn't political. It was a feral contagion. And Caedmon had to stop it. Caedmon was 20 years old. He had been king for 3 years, and every single one of those years had been spent trying to save his brother. Hadric's voice dropped. He tried everything. Healers, herbalists, restraints, isolation. He begged Torvin to fight it. He begged the Oracle for intervention. He spent every resource the crown had trying to find a cure that didn't exist. The silence stretched between them. "In the end," Hadric said quietly, "the Ashwood packs attacked a civilian settlement. Torvin led the assault. 14 people died, including 6 children." Thessaly pressed her hand to her mouth. "Caedmon led the response himself. He wouldn't send soldiers to do what he believed was his responsibility. He tracked Torvin through the Ashwood for 3 days, found him in the ruins of the village he had destroyed." Hadric stopped, took a breath. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its careful neutrality. Torvin had a lucid moment. Right at the end, the amber cleared from his eyes and he looked at Caedmon and said his name. Just his name. And then the feral took him again, and he attacked. And Caedmon, the beta, swallowed. Caedmon did what had to be done. The words settled over Thessaly with the weight of earth. "He killed his brother," she whispered. "He killed the thing his brother had become," Hadric corrected gently. "But Caedmon has never accepted that distinction. In his mind, he murdered the only family he had left, the fracture." The splitting landscape she had seen inside Caedmon's mind. The wolf on one side, the man on the other, and the bottomless crack between them, fed by guilt, widened by grief, sustained by the unshakable belief that he deserved to end the same way his brother had. "The guilt is what's killing him," Thessaly said. "Not the feral progression itself. The guilt is feeding it." Hadric met her eyes. That is what I believe. Yes. And he won't let anyone close enough to help because he's convinced that everyone who loves him ends up destroyed by him. His father went feral and had to be executed. His mother died of grief within a year. His brother went feral, and Caedmon had to kill him personally. Hadric spread his hands. From where he stands, he is a curse. Everyone who gets close to him meets the same end. And now you, the one person who can save him, he pushes away because he believes proximity to him is a death sentence. Thessaly stood. The chair scraped against the stone floor. Where is he? She asked. His chambers. Cecily, he's given orders that you're not to enter his quarters. The guards will stop you. Then tell the guards to stand down. Hadric studied her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth twitched in something that was almost a smile. Give me 10 minutes. She waited. She paced the corridor outside Hadric's office, her pulse hammering, the bond humming so loud in her chest that she could barely hear anything else. Through it, she could feel Caedmon, the exhaustion, the grief, and the feral darkness, closer to the surface than it had ever been, pressing against the walls of his control like water against a dam. When Hadric nodded from the end of the corridor, she walked. The king's chambers were dark. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the floor. The desk was covered in untouched reports. The ink dried in the pen, and Caedmon stood by the window, his back to the door, silhouetted against a sky full of cold stars. He didn't turn when she entered, but she saw his shoulders stiffen. She heard the sharp intake of breath. I told Hadric no visitors, he said. I'm not a visitor, Thessaly replied. She closed the door behind her. The sound of the latch catching was very loud in the quiet room. You need to leave, he said, still facing the window. It isn't safe. You keep saying that. She took a step closer. You've been saying it since the moment the flame chose me. It isn't safe. You're a mistake. Go away. Another step. And every single time you've been wrong. He turned then. The starlight caught his face, and she saw the devastation written across it. The hollowed cheeks, the dark circles, the bruised veins crawling up his neck. His eyes flickered between gray and amber in a rhythm that looked agonizing, and his hands trembled at his sides. You don't understand, he said, his voice raw. Every person I've loved is dead because of me. I know about Torvin, she said quietly. He went rigid. The gold blazed behind his eyes. Hadric told me everything. Your father, your mother, your brother, the ashwood. She took another step. I know what the fracture is. I've been inside it. I've seen the crack between you and your wolf. And I know what's feeding it. Then you know why you should run, he said, and his voice broke on the last word. You know what I am. What I'll become. I can feel it happening, Thessaly. The wolf is winning. Every day it takes more of me, and I can't stop it. And when it's done, I'll be the thing that Torvin was, the thing my father was, and anyone bonded to me will die, Thessaly finished. I know, Vaedra told me. Then why are you here? He demanded. The words came out as a roar, raw and desperate, his control fracturing in real time. Why won't you leave? Every second you spend near me makes the bond stronger, and every second the bond grows, you're more tethered to a man who is going to destroy himself. Because I love you, Thessaly said. The words came out simple and clear and steady. She hadn't planned them. They were just true, and they rose from the place behind her ribs where the humming lived, and they filled the room. Caedmon stared at her. You don't know me, he whispered. You've known me for weeks. I've been inside your mind. I've felt what you feel. I know the weight you carry, and I know you carry it because you believe you deserve to be crushed by it. She closed the distance between them. You're wrong, his resolve cracked. She saw it happen, like ice fracturing across a frozen lake. Slow, and then all at once. His hand rose to her face, trembling, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her eyes burn. I have smelled you in every corridor of this palace, since the day you left, he said, his voice stripped raw. I hear your voice when I close my eyes. I reach for you at night, and the empty space where you should be is the only thing louder than the wolf. I tried to let you go. I tried to convince myself that sending you away was the right thing, the noble thing, and every single second of every single day without you has been the worst of my life. Thessaly kissed him. She rose onto her toes and pressed her mouth to his, and for one heartbeat he was frozen, his hands hovering at her waist like he was afraid she would shatter. Then the dam broke. His arms wrapped around her, lifting her off her feet, pulling her against him with a desperation that stole her breath. The bond blazed in her chest, brilliant and blinding, and through it she felt his wolf go still for the first time since she had known him, not quiet, not suppressed, still, peaceful, whole. He carried her to the bed, not with urgency, but with reverence, setting her down like she was something sacred, something that might vanish if he moved too quickly. His forehead pressed against hers, their breath mingling. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. When the mating bite came, it was instinct. His teeth found the curve of her neck and she gasped, not from pain, but from the sensation of the bond locking into place. A golden thread that wound through every part of her, connecting her to every part of him, wolf and man, and the fragile, precious space between. She bit him back, marking him as hers, and felt his whole body shudder. The bond sealed, bright and warm, and terrifyingly permanent. They held each other afterward, tangled in sheets and starlight, and the quiet aftermath of something that had changed them both permanently. Cadmon's breathing was deep and even against her hair, and for the first time since she had met him, his body was completely relaxed. No tremors, no flickering eyes, no rigid control holding back the tide. "I don't deserve you," he murmured into her hair. "No," Thessaly agreed, smiling against his chest. "You really don't. But here we are." His chest vibrated with a low laugh, and the sound of it, real and unguarded and full of a warmth she had never heard from him before, made her eyes sting with tears she didn't bother hiding. She fell asleep listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong and synchronized with the pulse of the bond in her chest. The future felt possible, not easy, not guaranteed, but possible, and that was more than either of them had dared to hope for. She was smiling when the pulling started. It began as a tug behind her sternum, faint at first, easy to dismiss as the settling of the newly sealed bond. But it deepened, intensified, became a force she couldn't resist. The warmth of his body faded. The sound of his heartbeat grew distant. And then she was somewhere else. The fracture stretched before her, but it had changed. The crack was wider now, a chasm that pulsed with a terrible rhythmic energy. On the amber side, the wolf stood motionless, its burning eyes fixed on something Thessaly couldn't see. On the blue-gray side, Cadmon was nowhere, gone. Just empty space where the human half should have been, and from the bottom of the chasm, rising through the dark like smoke through a chimney, came a howl that shook the ground beneath her feet. The wolf turned its massive head and looked at her, and she understood with a certainty that froze the blood in her veins that the bond hadn't saved him. It had simply given the fracture a door to reach her, too. The fracture was worse than she remembered. The chasm had doubled in width since her last visit, a vast, pulsing wound in the landscape that swallowed light and sound and hope in equal measure. The amber side flickered weakly, the flame-colored trees dimming at their edges, their leaves curling inward, as though the fire that sustained them was dying. The blue-gray side was almost gone. What had been a structured landscape of stone and order had eroded to a narrow strip of crumbling ground, barely wide enough to stand on, its edges dissolving into the dark. Thessaly stood at the boundary and felt the wrongness of it in her bones. "Cadman!" she called. Her voice vanished into the chasm, swallowed whole, before the echo could form. The wolf stood on the amber side, massive and still, its burning eyes fixed on her. It didn't snarl. It didn't pace. It simply watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, and she realized with a jolt that it wasn't hostile. It was waiting for her to understand something she hadn't understood yet. She looked at the blue-gray side, empty, no trace of the human half. The stone corridors and ordered shelves had crumbled into rubble, and the rubble was sliding, piece by piece, into the chasm. "Where is he?" Thessaly asked the wolf. The wolf turned its enormous head and looked down, into the chasm. Thessaly's stomach dropped. She moved to the edge and peered over, and the darkness below was absolute. Not the absence of light, but the presence of something else. Something heavy and dense and alive, a blackness that moved with intention. And deep inside it, she saw him. Caedmon was sinking, not falling, sinking, slowly, as though the darkness were something viscous that was pulling him down inch by inch. His eyes were closed, his arms hung limp at his sides. And around him, circling like vultures in a thermal, the memories played on repeat. Torvin's face, lucid and human, saying his brother's name, the flash of the blade, the sound it made, the weight of the body afterward. Then the loop reset, and it happened again, and again, each repetition stripping something away from the man at the center, each cycle pulling him deeper into a guilt so profound it had become gravity. He wasn't fighting it. "He thinks he deserves this," Cecily whispered, the realization hitting her like a blow to the chest. The wolf made a sound, not a howl, not a growl, a whine. Low and desperate and aching, the sound of an animal watching its other half drown and being unable to reach him. And she understood at last what the fracture truly was. The wolf wasn't the enemy. The wolf had never been the enemy. The wolf had been trying to take over, not because it wanted to consume the man, but because the man had stopped wanting to survive. The feral progression wasn't the wolf attacking. It was the wolf attempting to save what the human mind had decided to abandon. Caedmon was letting himself die, and his wolf was going mad, trying to prevent it. Thessaly looked at the chasm. It was wide. The darkness was deep. The edges of the ground crumbled where she stood, and she could feel the pull of it, the seductive heaviness, the whisper that said there was no point in fighting something this vast, and this patient and this certain. She jumped. The darkness caught her like cold water, dense and suffocating, and the memories closed around her, immediately. Not his this time, hers. A stone step in the pre-dawn cold. A baby wrapped in undyed cloth, silent, left behind by people whose faces she would never know. The years that followed, each one, a lesson in the same curriculum. You are not enough. You are not wanted. You take up space that belongs to someone else. Be grateful for what you're given. Don't ask for more. Don't reach. Don't hope. Don't love. Because love requires someone to choose you, and no one ever will. She was a mistake. The king's voice, cold and dismissive, and the 53 minutes of believing she mattered, collapsing into nothing. The memories pressed against her, trying to drag her down the way they were dragging him, and for a terrible suspended moment, Thessaly felt herself surrender to them. The weight was so familiar. She had been carrying it her entire life. It would be so easy to simply stop fighting, to let the darkness have her, to agree with every voice that had ever told her she was nothing, but then she felt the bond. Golden and warm and stubborn, blazing in her chest like a coal that refused to go out. It connected her to him, even here, even in the dark, a thread of light in the void, and she realized something, so obvious it almost made her laugh. She had believed she was nothing, her whole life. And then, a sacred flame, older than memory, had looked at every soul in a crowded hall and chosen her, not because she was powerful, not because she had a name or a bloodline or anything the world considered worthy, because she was enough. She had always been enough. The flame knew it, the wolf knew it. And somewhere, beneath the guilt and the grief and the crushing weight of his own self-destruction, Caedmon knew it too. Thessaly reached through the darkness and found his hand. "I know what it feels like," she said, and her voice carried through the void like light through a crack. "I know what it's like to believe you deserve the worst thing that ever happened to you. I spent 22 years believing I was left on those steps because something was wrong with me, Because I was deficient. Because I was a mistake. His fingers twitched in hers, the faintest response. The memories circled closer, Torvin's face, the blade, the sound, pressing in on him from every side. But I wasn't a mistake, Thessaly continued, her grip tightening. And neither was what happened in the Ashwood. You went to war because your brother was killing innocent people. You tried everything else first. You begged, you negotiated, you exhausted every option. And when there was nothing left, you did the hardest thing anyone could ever be asked to do. And you did it because it was right. She pulled him toward her, fighting the gravity of the darkness, feeling it resist. Torvin said your name at the end. You think that was an accusation, but it wasn't. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't know if they were hers or his, or both. He recognized you. He saw his brother. And in his last lucid moment, the only word he could find was your name. That's not blame, Kayadman. That's love. He knew you would carry this, and if he could speak to you now, he would tell you to put it down. Kadmon's eyes opened. Fully, completely, humanly gray. No amber, no flicker. Just a man looking up at a woman through a darkness that had held him for years, and seeing, for the first time, a way out. I don't know how to put it down, he said, his voice raw and small and stripped of everything. You don't have to do it alone, Thessaly said. That's what I'm here for. That's what the bond is for. Not because you're broken. Because no one should have to carry this much by themselves. She pulled. He rose. The darkness resisted, clutching at him. The memories screaming louder. Torvin's face, his mother's face, his father's face, every ghost demanding payment for a debt he had convinced himself he owed. And then, the wolf was there. It leaped into the chasm, massive and blazing, amber light pouring off its fur like flame. It landed beside Kadmon and pressed its enormous body against his side, and the man who had been at war with his own wolf for years reached out and buried his hands in the dark fur and held on. The fracture began to close. Slowly at first, the edges of the chasm, pulling together, like the lips of a wound, finding each other. The amber side and the blue-gray side merged, the flame-colored trees growing through the stone corridors, the order and the wildness weaving together into something new, something whole. The memories didn't disappear. They were still there, Torvin, the Ashwood, the blade. But they were no longer circling. They settled into the landscape like stones in a riverbed, present but no longer sharp, part of the terrain but no longer the terrain itself. The wolf nudged its muzzle against Kadmon's palm. He pressed his forehead against its massive skull, and the boundary between man and wolf dissolved, not into feral chaos, but into the balance that had been missing for 3 years. Thessaly felt it through the bond, the moment the two halves became one, the moment the fracture sealed, the moment the king of the realm became, finally, and irrevocably, whole. The darkness evaporated, light flooded in. Thessaly woke in his arms, gasping, her face wet with tears. The king's chambers were warm with firelight. Dawn light pressed against the curtains in pale gold. Tidide-mon was awake, looking down at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not gratitude, though that was there. Not relief, though that was there too. It was something quieter. Something that lived beneath both of those things. Peace. He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks, and when he kissed her, it tasted like the first breath after a long time underwater. Thank you, he whispered against her lips, for jumping. Thessaly smiled through her tears. You would have done the same for me. He pulled her closer, pressing his forehead to hers. In a heartbeat. In every heartbeat. For the rest of my life, they held each other as the dawn broke fully, the bond humming between them, warm and golden and whole. The fracture didn't heal overnight. Wholeness, Thessaly learned, was not a destination but a practice. Some mornings, Kayadman woke with gold, flickering at the edges of his vision, the old guilt stirring in the dark places where it had lived for so long. On those mornings, she held his hand and talked to him the way she had in the beginning, about nothing important, and everything that mattered, until the amber faded, and his breathing steadied and the wolf settled back into its place beside the man, rather than against him. Some nights, he dreamed of Torvin. Not the nightmares that had consumed him before, not the looping memory of the blade and the sound it made, but quieter dreams. Memories of before. Torvin, teaching him to track in the northern forests. Torvin, laughing at something stupid. Torvin ruffling his hair and calling him Little King, in the way that used to make him scowl, and now made his chest ache with a grief that was slowly learning to coexist with gratitude. "You're allowed to miss him," Thessaly told him one night, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "You're allowed to grieve and still choose to live. You sound like a very wise person." "I once called a mistake," he murmured into her hair. "You are never going to live that down. I don't deserve to." Their mating was officially announced on a Tuesday because Thessaly refused to have it happen on a ceremonially significant day. "I am not walking into the Great Hall on the summer solstice," she told Hedrick flatly. "I will trip on something. I will knock over the Oracle's basin. It will be a disaster of historic proportions, and the archivists will record it forever." The court's reaction was exactly what she expected. A foundling bookbinder, with ink-stained fingers and no surname, standing beside the Alpha King as his bonded Luna. The whispers followed her through every corridor, clung to the hem of every gown she wore, and settled like dust in every room she entered. She bore it the way she bore most things, with quiet steadiness, and the private knowledge that the man who had once called her a mistake now reached for her in his sleep, like she was the only solid thing in his world. "They'll adjust," Caedmon told her one evening, pulling her onto his lap in the study with the casual possessiveness of a man who had stopped caring what anyone thought. "And if they don't, I'll have Hadrick draft a royal decree mandating enthusiasm. You cannot legislate enthusiasm. Watch me." Months passed. The feral episodes faded to nothing. The bruised veins in his wrists cleared. His healing returned to normal, then better than normal, the bond feeding his body as steadily as it fed his soul. The wolf, no longer fractured, no longer desperate, ran beside the man in perfect synchrony. On a quiet morning in early spring, Thessaly woke to pale light and birdsong, and the steady warmth of Caedmon's arm draped across her waist. He was still sleeping, deeply, peacefully, his face relaxed, his breathing slow and even. No amber behind his eyelids, no tremors in his hands, no crack in the ground waiting to swallow him whole. She watched him for a moment, the way she had watched him that very first night, when he fell asleep at his desk to the sound of her voice, and the warmth in her chest, golden and settled and permanent, told her everything she needed to know. She was not a mistake. She had never been a mistake. The flame had known it first. The wolf had known it second. And the man, stubborn and broken and brave and hers, had learned it last. Thessaly settled back against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and let the morning hold them both.